Hi, I'm Jerry Hogue,
And I'm Ryan Deerking.
and welcome to Chapter 6 of the story.
Tonight, we're going to learn about Moses and the wanderings. So we've chosen a question from that, but to give you a little background, we find ourselves here leaving Mount Sinai after God had just given the Israelites the law, and now he's going to be leading them to the promised land for the first time, and in doing so, he's going to have to deal with the Israelites and a lot of their grumbling, and just their non-content. And we're going to see then he goes to the promised land, and they send in the spies, and they come back, and they feel like they are unable to overcome, even though God has assured them that they could. So in doing so, God then forces them back into the wilderness for 40 years for disobeying him. And along the way, Moses is there leading them throughout this entire 40 years, just as Moses was chosen to lead his people out of Egypt. And so our question for this evening is from chapter 6, number 4. What do you learn from Moses' leadership throughout this difficult period, and how did he display his frustration and faith? And I think we're going to focus primarily on the initial question and then touch on his frustration as well as his faith.
Yeah, Moses is an interesting character study when it comes to the subject of leadership. Not just because leadership is such a popular subject right now in all the world, both business and church, but more specifically because he stands out as such a significant character in Bible history. Mm-hmm. So he provides some very interesting examples for us that Ryan and I noted in our study in preparation for this make him very much like Christ and a type of Christ in his role as the leader of the people and his goal as the leader of bringing them into the kingdom that God had intended for them. Ryan has already alluded to, and we discussed at length, the complaining and grumbling that the people did throughout their wandering in the wilderness.
Yes.
And it was interesting that all of their grumbling and complaining, while it may have been around some specific issues like meat or water, in all of those instances, what the person that they grumbled against was Moses. So his entire tenure as the leader of the people of Israel was characterized not only by these fantastic and wonderful interactions with God himself, but when it came to leading the people, it was fraught with this constant grumbling and complaining. And what God pointed out in every one of those instances, when Moses was called before him to answer the complaint and the grumbling, was that while they were naming Moses as the leader with whom they were unhappy, God pointed out that it was really against him that they were grumbling and complaining. They were rejecting God as their leader. And that was the news that Moses brought to them each time, while also providing for the needs about which they'd been complaining, like meat and water.
Right. I think some of that deals primarily with, we get down to his humbleness. Yes. I think that's where we find the unique trait of Moses in this whole rhythm of wandering through the desert.
The verse that I keyed on when we were talking about Moses was one that we don't often think about a leader. And that is in Numbers chapter 12, where not only was it the people of Israel that were complaining against him, but even his own brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam, were jealous of Moses and his role and responsibility, but also his relationship with the Lord, saying, "Has he not also spoken to us?" And it's in that context, when God calls all three of them before him, that the Lord makes the observation, "Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth." Some of the other translations translate meekness as humble. So Moses is often referred to as the most humble man, not only in all the Bible, but that passage says over all the face and among all the people of the entire earth. We don't often think of the leader as being a humble person, but I told Ryan as we prepared for this that I was reminded, if I may use an analogy from the business world, of the book that was written a few years ago by Jim Collins called Good to Great. And he was looking at what he considered to be the transition of a few companies from the level of good to a level of greatness. And as he examined those companies, one of the things that he found was what he characterized as a level 5 leader. And their primary characteristics were a combination of humility, humbleness, and meekness, contrasted with what we think of as the typical charismatic and powerful CEO. Humbleness combined with the personal drive and motivation to achieve the goal that was set before us. In that context, Moses very much fits that model of leadership. A very humble person, always deferring to someone else, seeking to put someone else forward. An example I would give of that would be at those times when, in their grumbling and complaining, God became angry at the people of Israel. In a couple of instances, his intent was to completely wipe them out because of their sin and their unbelief and their rebellion, and to start fresh and anew with Moses and to build a new holy and special nation for himself. In every one of those instances, Moses said, don't do that. He appealed to the name of God, as we noted in last week's video, specifically not only his steadfast love, but his mercy and grace, those two things in God's name that characterize who he is. Moses always appealed to that and said, don't do that. And he interceded for the people and asked for their forgiveness. So even though they were complaining against him and against God, Moses continued to be humble and to continue to press toward the mark and the goal that they had set before them.
One other thing that we had talked about was also him being able to delegate. And he was able to take advice and then internalize that and appropriately relegate or delegate individuals over certain aspects of the Israelite community, whether it be their spiritual or for their judicial. There were several instances where there were problems coming in, and he was the sole provider of the decisions that needed to be put forth. And then his father-in-law came in and said, Moses, why burden yourself with all of this? And so it's in those examples that we find that he is able to then take some of that leadership role and disperse it among trusted individuals, the elders of the community, that would allow I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but allow a smoother train.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Basically levels of delegation. Jethro told him, divide the people into thousands, into hundreds, into 50s and 10s, and designate a leader over each one of those who can handle the small things, and then only let them bring the large things to you for the big decisions.
So now turning on to the last part of our question, where it discussed how did he display his frustration and faith. I think the classic example when we think of that is when Moses disobeyed God and struck the rock twice rather than actually speaking to the rock. And there have been several other instances with his frustration with the Israelites and their disobedience towards God. But that one is remarkable in that particular frustration led to him not being able to enter the promised land.
Right.
But in all those cases, even that one, he was able to have a steadfast faith. And what we really wanted to point out too is how that faith was guided towards the Messiah to come.
Yes.
And if we look at Deuteronomy 18, verse 18, we will read, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I commanded him. I think that's a fairly definitive statement there, saying that the Messiah will come out of the Israelites and will be the prophet of all prophets.
Right. And interestingly, Moses characterizes that prophet as being just like him. So when we think about the leadership of Moses with the people of Israel as he brought them to the promised land, you can't help but think about Christ. Ryan pointed out several instances in our study last night about Moses' willingness to sacrifice himself on behalf of the people of Israel, and even to bear that burden of carrying their sinfulness and interceding for them before God to the degree that God would forgive them, and promised to Moses that he would carry them forward and fulfill all the promises that he had made concerning the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, exactly like Christ and what he did for us.
So we hope that answers the question that we decided to answer tonight, and we will look forward to tackling the next question in chapter 7.
Which takes us into the promised land. Make sure you do your reading and studying. We'll see you next week.
Bye.